Hey, what's going on, Mission Hills Church? Welcome back to the Continuing the Conversation feed here on the Messages podcast. You're back with your host, Colin and
Craig.
And we're really excited, man. We are getting into the nitty gritty of it now. We are just knee deep in the Beyond series and campaign right now. How are you feeling, Craig? I mean, this is
tired.
Not a small undertaking, man.
No, I'm tired. This has been a big series for a lot of different reasons. You know, I've said several times that it's not a financial campaign with some faith stuff on the side. It really is a faith thing with some financial stuff on the side. The financial stuff is really it's an application for the faith building piece of it. And I think anytime you're working out, it's tiring. I feel like I'm working out my faith. I'm trying to help other people work out their faith, and I'm just tired. It's been a long season.
All I could think about, I know you're not much of a sports guy, but we are in the midst of March Madness kind of as we are going along right now.
I did know that. Yes.
So see, there we go. And it's kind of in my mind this whole time. I've been kind of thinking about how cool is it that, we got invited into the dance here. And then each week we keep moving forward and, you're playing these games and you're getting more tired, but it's really cool that you keep advancing. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about the Beyond campaign so far. How cool is it that we are in here and we're watching God move in a bunch of different ways here at Mission Hills Church and in the Front Range. But it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. But when you see the advancement, when you see the progress, it's worth it, right? And I really have had a number of conversations with people that have kind of surprised me about how much they're telling me that their faith has been challenged and they've been built. I had a really sweet conversation with a woman who's been part of the church for a long time, and she brought a gift to Beyond, and I was like, oh, we're not really taking the checks right now. This is, the commitment Sunday's coming. She's like, well, there's a story here. And the story was that her husband was really not on board with faith, and so she'd never been able to give financially, even though she's been involved with this for a long time. And she said, but some stuff kind of happened in their personal lives, and he realized, I think I need maybe to explore this God thing. So he started coming at the beginning of the Beyond campaign. Of course, in my, I'm like, oh, that's, it's the worst time.
What a time to start.
Right? And it was funny because I've said a couple different times, if you're new here, you're thinking, oh, this is the worst time to find this church. But actually, it's maybe the best time. I've said that, but I don't know that I fully believed it. And but her husband came, and the first message, he went, yeah, we need to follow Jesus, and we need to, I've not been trusting God with anything, let alone my finances. So he told her, yeah, we need to give to this. So that was his first weekend there. And it was the first time she'd been able to give in their marriage. And he's been coming regularly, and he said, we need to start giving on a regular basis. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. It's not about the numbers on the check. That's irrelevant to me. I actually don't even remember what the check was. It's that, oh, no, God's moving and speaking, and he's calling people to a higher level of trust in him. God's using it that way. So, yeah, I'm a little tired, but I've heard a lot of those kinds of stories. Probably more stories in this series than I have in any other series, actually, of people going, yeah, my faith's growing, and I'm realizing I need to do this, and that God's got me. And, yeah, so it's tiring, but it's been fun.
That's really cool. I want to push into a leadership concept with that, and hopefully you have some tidbits for us here. There's you're talking about being tired and also talking about, looking back, hindsight 2020, and seeing all the advancement is really cool. But as you are living in that kind of advancement and the trench work and stuff, there's a quote from Muhammad Ali where they said, oh, you must have loved training because you were, this great athlete. And he goes, no, I hated every minute of it. All I could think of was suffer now and spend the rest of your life as a champion. And do you have anything that you do where you're kind of in that trench work and you're like, I know where this is going and I know what this could become so that I am able to do A, B, and C in order to make, today go by?
Yeah, so that my big thing is rhythm. It's not about balance. If it were balance, then God would have said, work for 3.5 days and take 3.5 days off. It's not balance, it's rhythm.
Which we're not encouraging. Some people do
that. Yeah, you're our employee, so we're definitely not encouraging that for you or for any of our employees. That would, the 3.5 day work week, right? Although there are people pushing towards that.
It's very European, I feel like.
It's very European, but I don't think it's going to be good, actually, because I actually don't think that's healthy for people. I think we were made to work. And I think there's got to be the right margin and rhythm of rest as well, but I don't think that would be healthy for us long term at all. But it's about margin, it's about rhythm, and I'll be honest, my margin and my rhythm has not been great over the last couple of months, which is part of the reason I'm as tired as I am. But it's one of those things. If you think about the drum kit, we're not playing the backbeat. Like we're in a fill season. Like the drummer's going crazy and everything's being hit, and you can only do that for so long. But I am trying to find micro rhythm things. So I'm leaving a little bit earlier than I often would during the day, and just trying to get a little bit more space there, or being a little bit more intentional about when I do have some time off, like what am I doing with it? Like I'm not going to doom scroll, right? I'm going to go, no, I'm actually going to grab my Kindle and I'm going to sit on the front porch and I'm going to read a book, because that's actually much more restorative than the temptation of the flashy, Instagram kind of stuff. But so I'm being more intentional about those little moments that I have now than I probably am sometimes when I've got a little bit more of it. So yeah, when you have less of it, you've got to make it count more. So that's kind of the big thing that I'm doing right now.
And I know you've always tried to be intentional with kind of like taking care of yourself physically and take care of yourself mentally. So you're probably trying to find these pockets where you're reading the book to take care of yourself mentally. And I remember you and I were having a conversation, I think off mic, a couple weeks back, where you're like, you know what, I think I'm going to take off and I'm going to climb during my time.
Yeah,
So you're finding these two rhythms here.
I really got out of the rhythm of taking care of myself physically over the last probably 3 months. And so but right now I was realizing, I'm probably I'm headed towards a burnout if I don't get serious about this. And so it's counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people to go, well, I'm so tired, I got to go work out, right? But that's exactly what I have to do. And you know that. I'm so tired that I'm realizing if I don't take care of myself physically, it's just going to get worse and worse. So even though I'm really tired, even if I'm going to go to the gym for half an hour, right? Or we trick ourselves into this. I'm just going to go and I'm going to climb 3 routes, right? And then once I've climbed 3 routes, well, okay.
Feel pretty good.
I feel pretty good. I could climb a 4th route or a 5th route. I got to tease myself into actually doing a considerable workout. But yeah, I am so tired that I'm like, I have to work out. I'm too tired not to work out at this point is basically what's happening.
I know my key to success is I always go to the gym at 5, and everyone's like, how do you do that? I'm like, you get through half your workout before you really wake up. So it's kind of like it's my cheat. I get all my treadmill in and a little bit of the lifting in before the endorphins really kick in. I'm like, you know what? I'm almost out of here, honestly. So yeah, I feel that.
I'm not sure I have that level of discipline, but I appreciate it about you.
I think this ties in really well to one of the points that you made that I think is super applicable to our lives. So while you're in the trench work, it's important to find these rhythms where mentally and physically you're taking care of yourself, and then you get to the point where hindsight, you're like, that was worth it. But sometimes we get into the end point and we forget to look back, and then we start to look forward to more barriers or another challenge that's coming up, and you're like, you know what? That actually wasn't so bad what I came out of before. I'd like to go back to the season that I was in or the situation that I was in. Can you talk into a little bit of that maybe in your life recently, or any situation that you've had coming out of that? Because I know the Israelites, as we were talking about, kind of fell into that temptation, this mental temptation. And how have you found that it's these steps that we can avoid that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, so it came out in the message this weekend because the Israelites are kind of trapped between all these different barriers, and they're like, why did we come here? Why didn't we stay in Egypt? Didn't we say leave us alone? We're just happy to serve. No, they didn't say that. If you go back into that part of the Bible, they were crying out to God, would you get us out of this? And now they're like, we actually never really wanted to leave. Why did you pull us out of this? Because you asked, right? Which is a great example of this. Sometimes what God leads us into makes us forget about what He's led us out of. And I think it happens all the time. I look at it in my life. I think on the big scale, when I came to Mission Hills, God led me into something that seemed really exciting at first. I was like, it's more influence, it's more opportunity for impact. It's a staff that means I don't have to do all the things anymore. I used to do all the things. I don't have to do all the things anymore. And the staff's doing them so much better than I was ever able to do them. And so, that's great. But then you start going, but I have to lead this staff, and I have to deal with, the finances of a large organization, and how do we handle conflict when there's so many people involved in it, and quite honestly, even in the early days of getting here and realizing how big the leadership burden was, there were a bunch of days that I was like, "Ooh, boy, my last church was so much easier." And the thing is, it wasn't. It wasn't easy. It was different. It was a different kind of hard, and maybe on some level the weight was smaller because I wasn't leading a staff of call it 100 people. I was leading a staff of there were 4 of us, right? But the flip side is that at the 100, there's 100 staff who are dividing up the responsibility and exponentially increasing the impact. But when I was dealing with all the hardness of leading that, the staff of 4 felt really good, right? When COVID hit and everybody at this church had different opinions about mask or no mask, should we do this or should we do that? Yeah, because I don't know, I don't think you and I have ever talked about this. I have this standard joke when people go, hey, how long have you been here? I go, well, 8 years, but 3 of them were COVID years, so 57 years. I've been in missionals for
dog
57 years. Yeah, they're COVID years. They're 8 or 9 times. During COVID, it was this insane, the leading, and I wouldn't do it myself. I had a great team of elders, but we were just always, we were meeting every week. And usually we meet once a month. We were meeting every week, and there were just so many, how do we handle this? Do we do this? Do we do that? Well, people are not like this. And it was so exhausting. There were days that I was like, it'd be nice to go back to where there's just, it's a small group of people. Instead of 3,000, it's, 300. That'd be so nice. But the reality is when it's only 300, everybody feels like their opinion matters at a really different level. And so they'll all tell you. When there's 3,000, a lot of people are like, it's a big church, my opinion doesn't really count in the same way, so I'm not going to send the email, right? Whereas at 300, you're going to hear from 75% of those people, whereas at a church of 3,000, you're maybe going to hear from 5% of those people. So the situation that you're in always makes you kind of look back nostalgically at the situation that God brought you out of, but it's a rose-colored lens. You're not really remembering it right. Mm-hmm. And I think when my kids were teenagers, my kids were great kids, but teenage is a rough period of time, right? I wouldn't go back to being a teenager for anything.
No.
Oh, it's awful,
no.
Right? And walking with them through those things and breakups and just all the heartache and all that stuff, you're like, I can't wait till my kids are adults and they're out of the house. And now they're adults and they're out of the house. I'm like, we're still their parents. But the problems that they're dealing with and what it looks like to parent them through the adult years, in some ways, I'm like, boy, I really miss them being teenagers, right? I just think it happens all the time. Whatever stage you're in that God's led you into, you often forget what he's led you out of.
Yeah, I forget who this is attributed to, but you made me think of a quote. It's time plus experience equals comfort, but the comfort doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily mean I'm in a pillow bed comfortable. It's just how to deal with the situation.
Yeah.
So the longer you are doing something, the harder it is to move on to the next stage, because you're like, even though that was terrible, I knew how to do that. Yeah. This is something, and people can get freaked out by that sort of change, kind of moving into this new area that God is leading you. And I always fall back. This is one of my favorite things to talk to you about here is just this thing that I always fall back on where God's got this. And it's the most reassuring thing in my faith because I have no idea what's over the horizon. I don't know where he's leading me, but I know that he is equipping me to move into that situation so that I will hopefully be prepared to deal with it. And that falls back on, my trust in him to lead me into that situation.
Yeah. And I love that about you. I'll be honest, it's an area I struggle in my faith a little bit. I believe it. I believe that God's got this. I find myself often struggling with, but what does it look like for me to let God got this, right? Without failing to do what I'm expected to do. And there's this interesting tension, right? I even think that there's a place in the book of Acts where Paul talks about, God said, I'm going to take you to this place. And so Paul immediately began trying in every way to get there. And apparently that was a good thing. But he tried some things and they didn't work before he found the one. So God said, we're going to do this. And then so Paul's like, okay, let's get busy. Okay, yeah, God's got this, but I'm probably not going to see him get this if I just sit on my butt, right? And not work and not try to be faithful. So a great example right now, actually, I'm hoping that there's some longevity to this, me saying it. But we've been looking to get a Castle Rock campus. We have a campus there. We've been looking to get them a permanent space. And it's just like doors have not opened. We've sensed God leading us to be there, and He opened the door to be able to start the church in the weekend only rental, but He just has not opened a door. But we really sense that He was calling us there, and so there's this sense of God's got this, and people will say, yeah, He's going to provide, but like I keep knocking on doors, and we check in the listings for spaces and all those kinds of things, and then just last week, my wife was in the grocery store, and she met a woman that we knew from our last church, and she's just talking to her, how you doing? And this woman said, well, I'm doing okay. We're kind of struggling a little bit. We had this like building, and we were leasing it to a car dealership, and then the car dealership went bankrupt, and so now like we have this building, and I guess we got to do a car dealership in the building, and we don't really want to do a car dealership, and my husband's not having a lot of luck finding the right cars to put in it, and so like Clutta told me, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So we just drove by there the other day. Actually, Monday of this week, we drove by there, and he's a kind of a longtime acquaintance friend of ours. He was in there, so we were like, well, what's going on? He kind of said, and I said, well, do you want to lease it to us? And he's like, I'd love to lease it to you. I'm like, wait, hang on a second, because nobody in Castle Rock will talk to a church at this point. So he kind of showed us the building, and we're like, I think we can make this work. And that's where we are right now. We're still trying to figure it out. We gotta get the city to approve the usage of the building, and we've got a parking problem to solve. But I can already see some things that God's done even around it that would possibly allow for the parking situation. And so it's like, okay, well, I was trying really hard, and nothing was happening. And then all of a sudden, it kind of feels like God's like, yeah, I got this. So, like, did I mess up all these other months? Did our campus pastor Tanner, did he mess up? Did my exec team, have we messed up by looking? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. And yet it's almost like God was like, yeah, go ahead and look so that, oh, okay, now I see it. Now I see it. I see what you're doing there, Jesus. So this week, I'm going to talk about the fact that sometimes God allows us to feel the problem so that we really appreciate the provision. Right? I think that's probably what it was. If I hadn't been doing the work, I don't think this thing suddenly would have fallen into our laps, right? Mm-hmm. And God willing, it's going to work out, and you're going to listen to this, 3 months from now, and like we're going to be rolling and getting that permanent location up in Castle Rock based on this space. But yeah, like I fully appreciate the problem. The size of the problem is huge. That Castle Rock's growing like crazy. There aren't a lot of spaces. Where there are spaces, they're kind of at a premium, and so nobody wants to rent to a church. And because there's no, profit sharing or any of those kinds of things. And so appreciating the size of the problem, now, if this is God's provision, I'm like, oh, I appreciate it at a whole new level. So yeah, God's got this, and yet there's still, sometimes He's like, yeah, but I'm going to make you work a little bit for it so you know how powerfully I'm working, I think.
It's really good. I like that. It's all about kind of the lens of your perspective lens that you look at everything through. I think what always helps me kind of in that same thing is my sports background. I played, baseball forever, and in order to make the Hall of Fame as a hitter, you have to do your job right 1 out of 3 times. And then you are one of the best of your position. You make the Hall of Fame. So I always try, and it's probably a lazy. So you were talking earlier about kind of this approaching something and not knowing where to start with it. I think sometimes on the flip side of that coin, I feel lazy in my faith because I'm like, God's got this, because we're going to, like you said with Paul and, looking at Castle Rock and everything, like we're going to get there. But I tend to look at that as like, am I being too lazy in my approach to what the solution is going to be? Because I'm like, if I'm successful 1 out of 3 times, I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame. We're going to be all right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
so
interesting.
So it doesn't come without its drawbacks.
Yeah, so you worry you're being lazy. I worry that I'm working too hard and stepping on God's toes. And I think sometimes we do the best we can and we take our nap.
Yeah.
Right?
Ooh, I like that. Talk about rhythms of rest.
Yeah. And we're just wired in different ways. And, I think that's... I think probably the reality is there's a whole leadership thing here. Our greatest strength is usually our greatest weakness, right? And so I think about it sometimes like, the bigger your strength is, like a big mountain, the longer the shadow it casts. And, I think you've got a really powerful faith. There's just an ability to trust God in some really powerful ways, and I love that. That's a big mountain. The shadow side of that is that sometimes God may call you to do some work, that you're not going to be inclined to step into immediately. So because you're like, well, God's got this. He's like, yeah, I do, but
You also have to pick up the shovel.
I'm also good. Yeah, I mean, yeah, get to pick up the shovel. I love that. My strength probably is He's gifted me with some strategic thinking and a really hard work ethic. That's a mountain, but it's got a shadow side, which is I can feel like it's all on me, and it's never all on me. It's really never on me at all. I'm just like supposed to pick up a shovel, So yeah, mountains, shadows.
I like that, and I think the Venn diagram of where you and I are able to overlap is that really distinct 30,000-foot view of like where we're going and where we've been, which I think leads me into the other point that I thought was really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen you come up front and you say, "Hey, we're going to talk about 2 words today."
Yeah.
Usually it's a good mix between a couple verses and a lot of verses. It's never usually a couple words, but this week we talked about turning back, and I wanted to push into the distance of that in a situation where the Israelites have become comfortable and they are relying on this distance that they've built up. And God's like, no, you know what? We're gonna U-turn this thing and we're gonna come back into it. So I will be glorified in this situation. I want to push into that a little bit with you today.
Yeah.
How was it coming to that conclusion while you were being led to this passage through different, listening to God and, reading other interpretations of this passage? How was it coming to that? I always like hearing your study method coming to this.
Yeah, so interesting enough, I can tell from this question that you listened to the Saturday night message, because I had actually shifted a lot of the way I introed it by Sunday.
Okay.
And it's funny, because going in, so here's the background, you're asking about the process kind of a thing. So I do a lot of study. Obviously, I'm trying to make sure I understand God's word. I don't want to say in the name of God what God never intended to say. I don't want to use a text to say something that's not actually there. But I also want to make sure that I do say everything that's there. And so there's a lot of study, there's a lot of prayer. And sometimes I have this experience where I'm like I can feel there's something there that God has for me that I'm not quite making out. And this was a really interesting experience this weekend that even Saturday, and I work pretty much all day Saturday doing final revisions of the message, and I kept revising that intro, and I was just like, how am I? It's not quite right. It's almost this. It's like I could see it through the fog. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of launched it with this idea that it was all about turning back. And the next day I was on my way in to church, and I just had this moment of like, oh. And that's not quite it. So I entered it a little bit differently on the weekend. I kind of told a story about how familiar the story of parting the Red Sea is. And I told a story about a friend of mine who went crowd surfing off of a stage in Eastern Europe, and I kind of made anybody know what crowd surfing is? And it was like, yeah. And I was like, well, the Bulgarians didn't. And so they parted, and he fell and broke his leg. And the next day when he was preaching at the next concert we were doing, he talked about like what had happened the night before, and he kind of made the analogy like, and they parted like the Red Sea. And the funny thing is, all the Bulgarians like laughed because they all got it. And this was right after the Iron Curtain had come down, and so they didn't have Bibles, there weren't evangelical churches, and yet that's how ubiquitous the story is. Even in communist Russia, essentially. Mm-hmm. They still knew the story of how familiar this was.
It's amazing.
And so I entered it that way on Sunday. And what that allowed me to do, I think it allowed me to connect with the audience. It was a little bit of a funny moment, but also how familiar is this story? And then I was able to kind of go, and you know what's crazy? What nobody pays any attention to is why they were there. Everybody knows what happened, but almost nobody knows why it happened. Let me show you why it happened. Because they were making all this progress, they're getting all this distance, they're getting secure and comfortable, and then God goes, yeah, turn back. Give up that distance, right? So that, and I kind of heard that from the Spirit on the way in. I was like, I don't know why I didn't get that on Saturday. I just didn't. But Sunday, I suddenly heard it clearly, and so I was able to kind of redo that. So it was still about the turning back, but the process was really different, and I just hadn't quite nailed it on Saturday for whatever that's worth.
See, this is cool because you'll have to correct me on the stat here. I think the average family attends 1.38 1.83 times a month, something like
One-
that.
one- yeah, 1.3 something. in that
Yeah.
neighborhood. Or 1.6 actually.
1.6, there
well,
it
that
is.
was pre-COVID. I think it's lower than that now. but-
Yeah. So we often talk about this with the worship band a little bit. It's like, oh, I'm sick of singing the song. I'm like, well, if you think about it, the congregation's hearing it maybe 3 times a year on average. So I like this podcast in the sense that like now that everybody's listening to this, they get to see what goes on with the 4 services of preaching kind of going into this final message, because we'll post on YouTube and the podcast and everything like that, kind of this finalized version of what we're putting out. But like getting to see how the message changes from Saturday into Sunday, I think really speaks into the fact that you are like open to God working in the message too, which is really cool.
I'm genuinely seeking what God would have me say. And that sounds super charismatic in some ways. And I had a friend say this once, and I really like it. He said, "I'm a flaming charismatic without a prayer language." I'm like, that's actually kind of me. Like I don't speak in tongues. I've never done a healing or any of those kinds of things. But I really do believe in the personal direction of the Holy Spirit and learning to listen to the Holy Spirit and be led by Him. So I really am trying to do that. And sometimes, for whatever reason, it's a little harder to hear than other times. Yeah.
As we kind of wind stuff down today, we've got 2 weeks left in the Beyond series here, where we are going right into Easter, and then we're kicking off a really cool series that's kind of going to kind of be a magnifying glass a little bit on kind of what's happening here with the Beyond series and Easter and all of that, kind of like launching us into summer here. Can you talk a little bit about maybe your prayer life and your Mondays where you kind of do your writing and stuff like that, on how you are making room to move forward into this, not new season, but this expanded season here as we are kind of magnifying everything as we get.
Yeah, so I'm going to be perfectly real with you and say I've always struggled a little bit with prayer. And I think mainly struggled with it simply because I learned about prayer from people who had a particular kind of prayer life that probably didn't just line up super well with who I am. And so I've struggled over the years, but over the last several years especially, I feel like I've come to a way of thinking about prayer. And I heard somebody say this. I think his name is Wayne Cordero. Leads a really large church in Hawaii, of all places, right? Which I know sounds like a rough place to do ministry, but I bet it actually is a really rough place to do ministry for all kinds of reasons. But he talks about prayer life as thinking deeply in the presence of the Lord. And that really impacted me because I've started realizing, a lot of my prayer life is inviting God into whatever I'm dealing with. So when I sit down to work on the message, I'll go, "Hey, Holy Spirit, would you fill me up? And would you teach me so that I can teach the people that you've given me to lead?" And I don't necessarily spend an hour doing that. I'll read something, I'll study something in Scripture, and then I'll go, "Holy Spirit, what do you want me to do with that?" And I'll listen for a while. And sometimes that's, honestly, it's just thinking about it. But there's a sense that develops where I'm thinking about it, and I can almost feel the outside nudges to my thinking, and that sounds super mystical. But that's really is what I'm kind of learning. I've always been kind of fond of Jesus talking about hypocrites praying and thinking they're going to be heard by their many words. So like my prayer life probably has a lot more listening than it is actual words. I mean, "Hey God, really, would you do this?" Followed by, "Would you show me how you're going to do this?" And listening, would you give me something to speak to this people? Okay, well, what is it, right? And so I there's a freedom to think that once you've invited the Holy Spirit into those things.
No, I love that. And I think one of the first ways I ever felt connected to you, this is my first ministry job. And, we used to do these staff meetings where we would be at small tables, and then we would always end with prayer time, and everyone would kind of popcorn pray around. And I was always really scared of that because I was like, this is my first ministry job. They're going to think I'm a fraud. Like, I don't know the right words to say out loud for a prayer. And then the first time you were like, "I don't love praying out loud in front of people," I was like, "Oh, this is amazing." Like, I mean, one of the leaders of our church feels the way I do about this, because I always felt when I first started in ministry that I was lacking some sort of spiritual or faith depth because I wasn't wired that way.
Yeah, and again, I do think there's just wiring is the key phrase there. I think that people are just wired different ways, and it's so easy for us to expect everybody's spiritual life and their relationship with Jesus to look like ours. And in some ways, that's just an insecurity on our part. Like, well, but if you do it different, then that makes me feel like maybe I'm doing it wrong, right? So like I sense that. But yeah, I know it sounds like a really strange thing to do, to say that, like, as a pastor, I don't really like praying out loud. But I don't, because here's what I find is that when I'm praying in a group of people and I'm praying out loud, I pray out loud all the time by myself, actually. But when I'm in a group of people, when I'm praying out loud, I find that I'm not really praying. It's not authentic prayer for me. I'm usually performing for the people there. I'm so conscious, and it's probably part of my people-pleasing instinct and recovery process that I'm just thinking about, what are they going to hear and what are they going to think? And so I'm performing more for them than I am having an honest conversation with my Father. So yeah, I don't love it. Clutta does. Like Clutta loves
Clutta's
corporate
great.
prayer, and I've come to understand, like, there's no performance in it. It's genuine, deep, authentic prayer, and praying in the presence of others is a more powerful experience for her in some ways. And so I'm not going to judge her corporate prayer life because I don't love it. And hopefully, she does this, but hopefully every other prayer person doesn't judge the authenticity of my prayer life on the fact that I don't necessarily love doing it in some of the ways that they do. I do think there's a lot of uniqueness to us and the way God's wired us and built us.
Oh, I love that. That's I think a perfect place to end this.
Sounds good.
Really excited to dive into the next 2 weeks and beyond here. As always, if you guys have any questions, email us at info@missionhills.org. You and I were emailing a little bit about when we're going to have a mailbag. I think it is going to be following Mother's Day or something like that. It's coming up here May, June-ish. So get those questions in. We'll be answering those here on the podcast. Probably want to run a little bit longer to make sure we can tackle those. But as always, head over to our YouTube. We've got a couple playlists on there. Questions with Craig is a great one to start if you have any questions. And we'd love to hear from you guys. And as always, great to be here with you, Craig.
Good to be with you, Colin. God bless.
This podcast is hosted by Colin McFarland along with Craig Smith. We are mixed, edited, and produced by Zach Anderson. Our creative director is Colin McFarland. Maddie Brouwer is our SEO and copy specialist. The Continuing the Conversation feed is part of the Mission Hills Podcast Network in Littleton, Colorado, and available for download wherever you get your audio and video podcasts. Thanks for listening.